Good evening, and welcome to the second of Ancestry's 3 webinars this week. My name is Kory Meyerink. I'm with the ProGenealogists division of Ancestry.com. And tonight we're excited to talk about some of the ways that you can help discover the immigrants in your family tree. We're going to focus particularly on the strategies you might want to use for finding them in their hometown. And as you experienced last night, for those of you who were watching and listening to my colleague Kyle, we'll be using some questions from some of you at the end of this, or halfway through or so of the seminar, and talking a little bit more about specific examples of how we can use these strategies. So first we wanted to start with introducing the strategies to you that pertain to finding your hometown. And I think it's important first to underscore the importance of the hometown. Many immigrant origins researchers have learned that, but just to bring us all up to speed, the hometown in the old country is oftentimes the only place that you're going to find more records about those ancestors who lived in those old countries. It also makes it possible to learn more about the history of the immigrant, not just records, but the history, occupational issues, who their family was, all sorts of information like that. In fact, it's also virtually the only way you're going to find any earlier ancestors is if you can identify the specific hometown in the old country where your immigrant came from. I don't care whether it was Ireland, as Kyle talked about last night, Great Britain, as Kathy will talk about tomorrow, or anywhere else on the face of the earth, from Lebanon to Japan. We're going to focus a lot on European examples today. But the principles we're talking about right now are critical to understand regardless of where your immigrant came from and regardless of what country they went to. I realize that much of the audience is in the United States and Canada, but we have audience members watching this in Australia and in Europe and many other countries around the world. So on occasion I'll talk about the new country or the old country rather than America or England or Germany or something like that. Another reason to find that hometown is you might find additional relatives, additional immigrants who came as well, and that can be very beneficial to your research in general. So the very first strategy, the very first concept we need to make sure is that we have fully identified the immigrant. That is where many of us fall down, as it were, as we're getting started. We think we know about the immigrant, but we don't know enough. There are 4 essential elements that you need to know about each immigrant that you're looking for. First of all, logically, you need to know the name of the immigrant. And it's important to know that in the immigrant's native language. So if this was a German immigrant or an Italian immigrant, make sure that he wasn't just John, but he was Giovanni or he was Johann. Make sure you understand that because it's going to help you find him in other records, or her. It doesn't really matter, okay? So making sure you know the name of the immigrants. Sometimes we just say, Grandpa immigrated, but if we don't know Grandpa's name, we won't be able to find him. Second, you need to find a key event, the date of a key event over in the old country. It could be the person's marriage, it could be the person's birth, any major event that happened in the old country. Obviously they didn't die in the old country or they wouldn't be an immigrant. But if they were confirmed and you have that confirmation date in the old country, that's useful. But we need something to be able to hang our hat on, hang our research on when we get into those records in the old country. And fourth, and perhaps one of the most important is, third, we'll get to fourth in just a minute, you need to have the name or names of close relatives, such as a parent, a father's name, a mother's name, a sibling, even an aunt or an uncle, somebody in the old country that you can connect to the immigrant. Now, that may have been a fellow immigrant. Maybe a father and son and wife and daughter all came over together. That's great. But you're going to have to be able to identify him, and you identify an immigrant in large part by the people he's related to or she's related to. And lastly, and this is often the biggest hang-up for researchers, is to know the specific town where he or she lived. That's the tough one. That's where most people have questions, and that's where a lot of our discussion today is going to go. But keep in mind that all 4 of these are needed. You may inherit the family Bible. It may include your ancestor's birth date. It may include the ancestor's hometown. But if you don't have other information like other relatives, then you still might not be able to find that ancestor even in that hometown, because there might be many people with that ancestor's name. So keep that in mind. So as we proceed along the path of finding an immigrant's origin, okay, there are several rules. We're going to go through each of these rules briefly and then in just a little bit more depth before we get into some of your questions. First rule is always start in the records of the new country. Start where the immigrant came to. That's where you're going to find more records, and that's where you already know more about the immigrant. Second, focus on finding all 4 of those elements of identification we just talked about. Make a little checklist if you need to make sure you've got all those 4 found. Then 3, systematically search for all possible records in the new country. If they came into Canada, if they went to South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, Argentina, United States, systematically look for every record about that immigrant in that country. Rule number 4, don't try to use records in the old country until you've fully exhausted records in the new country. In other words, too many people, and this will be reflected in some of the questions I think we're looking at today, is they jump too quickly to try to find their ancestor over in England or over in Norway or over in the Netherlands. They don't know enough to recognize that immigrant or to find them. Make sure you don't try to jump to the old country before you have enough information about him. Okay? Here's the 8 strategies I want to introduce to you. And so don't worry about writing them all down now. We're going to go through each one momentarily. But there are strategies that we can follow one by one, step by step, to keep your research organized, to keep you on the right track so that you don't get lost, you don't get confused, and you can systematically knock these off step by step. And if you do this carefully, consistently, most of the time you'll be successful in finding that ancestor and where they came from. So always, always, always begin with family sources. It may be the family Bible in your possession. They usually don't tell you the name of the town where the ancestor came from. That's okay. But take note where that Bible was published, if it was published in the old country. Look for the other data that's there. Look for handwriting that might be in the foreign language your ancestor used to speak. That will help you understand if this family Bible was written in the old country or the new country or by the immigrant generation. So always look for family Bibles. But that's not all. Look for personal writings. Many times we've been able to find an ancestor's hometown because a family had held on to postcards and letters that had been written from their relatives in the old country over to the new country. So look for those letters. Look for a diary or a journal. It could even be as simple as a receipt somebody had for sending money back to the old country when they were here making money in the mines. Watch for personal papers. They're incredibly important as well. You might find an ancestor's passport. You might find certificates. Oftentimes I've seen baptismal certificates that were possessed by the American family that mentioned where in Europe the ancestor was baptized. I've seen confirmation certificates. It's wonderful if you'll take another time, dig through those home sources, and start asking other members of the family who else might have records. Remember, you're probably not the only descendant of that immigrant. There may be cousins of yours out there who have more data too. Once you've gone through those family sources, you can begin to look in other sources. And I always like to begin with what I call general previous research sources. This means the broad-based things that a lot of people have already done, okay? This could be family history books or articles that maybe have been written about your immigrant. There's a website we may look at a little later called genealogybooklinks.com. The periodical source index over at Ancestry. Great sources to try to find generally what other people may have researched. Of course, electronic family trees are really prevalent today. That's what I like to call them. At Ancestry, they're called the public member trees or the private member trees for some of you as well. Those can be great leads. They may not have all the right answers. They may not have sources, but they do have data. You can figure out in the course of your research how accurate the data is, but make sure you don't overlook a search of those family trees that are out there at Ancestry site and at many other sites. There are other databases you may want to look at, genealogy forums, family websites you may find through an internet search. So look for broad-based sources that people have already published material about the origins of an immigrant. There may be some other major collections out there. Maybe they are recently published materials online. Recently I was reviewing information about a Hessian soldier, and there is an archive or a historical society back east that focuses on Hessian soldiers, and on their website was information about his origins. So watch for those type of collections that you might find. Once you've done that, then move to similar type of records kept at the local level. I call them local records of previous research. These are genealogical compendia, genealogical dictionaries where a previous researcher has gone through and located a lot of information about a number of different families and written them up in a book or on a website. Local histories, particularly county histories, town histories in New England, can be a goldmine of information. If your ancestor had a biography published about him or something of that nature, then that biography will often say where and when he or she was born. In that same vein, look for collective biographies. These are those books, we sometimes call them mug books. They don't even have any history in them. They're just page after page of biographical sketches. It's amazing what you can find. And sometimes they're just at the county level. Sometimes they're about vocations. My wife and I found information about one ancestor in a book called Biographical Sketches of Knox County Writers. Knox County is a small rural county in Ohio. In the 1930s, a local school teacher wrote a whole book about people in that county who were writers. And my wife's ancestor had been a bit of a poet, so there were 3 paragraphs about him. That's all. Typical little farmer, a justice of the peace in the local town, and that was all. But a biography about him told us where he came from. Watch for specific studies of immigrant groups. Some of you may be familiar with the works of Hank Jones or Annette Burgert if you've been doing research on Germans coming to America. There are other immigrant group studies that have been done where people have looked at a whole group of immigrants who came to America. They may have come out of Italy, they may have come out of Ireland or out of Scotland. It doesn't really matter, but these group studies oftentimes gives you information about where they came from in the old country. At the same time, be sure to be watching for any ethnic histories, any religious histories. If your family came from Lithuania, there's a limited number of sources for you to use, but there are sources out there, and you can find studies about Lithuanians who came into America. You can find religious histories about the old Lutherans or about the Mennonites or about the Amish or any other number of religious groups. Plenty of items that have been researched by others that you can look at to learn more about your ancestor. And don't overlook periodical articles. That's the reason Ancestry has the periodical source index on their website. We'll take a look at that a little later, I hope. Once you've exhausted those sources, then you can move into what we call local original records. These are the records created when your ancestor was living there in the very locality where they lived. Church records are where I specifically like to go. Especially I like to look for ethnic churches. Churches that members of that ethnic group, that Italian or that Irishman or that German would attend. And those ethnic churches were often keeping records like they did in the old countries, and they would name where they came from in the old country in many of those records. Not always, but it's a great place to start. The other place I like to go to right away as soon as I can is to look for that immigrant's obituary. This is really great. If your immigrant was 19th century, died after the Civil War, there's a great chance that he had an obituary published about him, and that there's some mention in there about when he came to America or maybe even where from. Don't overlook the naturalization records in the local county court records, and of course vital records. You've probably already gone after a death record and said, Kory, that doesn't fit. He didn't say anything. Well, not about that immigrant. None of these sources is 100% guaranteed. That's why you have to use each and every one of them to eventually find the clue that your immigrant ancestor left behind. Even the U.S. Census can be beneficial for you. Not only will it put your ancestor in with his other relatives, it will remind you about other information when he came. It'll help you understand the country or state he came from. But I've even found hometowns named in the 1860 census on occasion. Hometowns of Germans, hometowns of Irish. So you never know what you're going to find. Take the time to dig into the census records and find them. Don't overlook the cemeteries and the mortuaries. They can have key information as well. I've often found in mortuary records, now they're private records owned by the mortician, but they may have information that's not posted anywhere else on their background about the family. Even probate records can be helpful, particularly for colonial issues. Oftentimes the New York Dutch would mention in their will in New York where they were born in the Netherlands 50, 60, 80 years earlier, back in the 1600s. So probate records can help you identify the immigrant better. The next step, and only at this point, is it efficient for you to go after immigration records and information about the immigration. Too often, and we're going to see that in some of our discussion here, we jump into the immigration records too soon before we've done this kind of homework. So begin, if appropriate, with the printed passenger lists and indexes. We're going to talk more about these, but this is particularly important for the pre-1820 immigrants to the United States. There's a wonderful database of Ancestry called Passenger and Immigration Lists Indexes. And that database has some great material for pre- and post-1820 immigrants. But 1820 is a key date we'll talk about later. Then you can search the manuscript customs and the manuscript immigration lists. Now, virtually all surviving U.S. and Canadian lists are available at Ancestry.com. Some of them are elsewhere as well. But it's wonderful, after my 30 years doing this, to have one place where I can search all those passenger lists at once. Now, passenger lists aren't perfect. They don't include everybody. People did slip through the cracks or through the decks, whichever way you want to put it. But they are critically important. Okay? Some of these records are indexed at alternate websites. And if another organization has indexed them, they may have indexed it in a little different way that's easier to find than what you might find on Ancestry. No index is perfect, so check and see if there's another index out there somewhere else. If you've done that much, now you've got a lot of information about your immigrant. You can move on to original records of other jurisdictions, and there's a lot more places to learn about your ancestor. Military records, if usually he, served in a war. Even if he didn't serve, they're draft registration records. I have found many World War I draft registration records that name a town in Poland or in Germany or in Slovakia where an immigrant came from. One of those 3 registrations was required to put a birthplace. Some weren't. But those registrations can be beneficial, and with the 30 or 40 million names in Ancestry in the draft registration records, it's a wonderfully underutilized source. Don't forget Social Security. If your ancestor lived into the 1940s, he probably filed for Social Security. And on the form, they asked for a birthplace and parents' names. Don't overlook that opportunity. They might not be in the Social Security Death Index, but they may still be there. Membership lists. Your ancestor probably belonged to an organization. He might have belonged to, in Cincinnati, there was a German Pioneer Society. And the membership lists are wonderful. They tell you the name of the ship, the date of arrival, the town they came from, the date, all sorts of great information on the membership records. Years ago, I was up in Helena, Montana, and I found a collection of membership records from a Croatian society. There were a lot of Croatian miners who'd gone up to Montana, and many of them belonged to this society. And on their membership rolls gave their name and their birth date in the native Slovakian languages that they came from, so Slovak languages. Even land records can be helpful. Maybe an ancestor homesteaded, and the homestead papers may help you. Certainly there's the state and federal grants, such as homesteads. Local deeds may give you a little more information about that ancestor. Okay. Now, if you've gotten to this step in the process, and you still haven't figured out where he's from or where she's from, then we have to go back and think about it a little differently. And then you take this tactic. Determine at least the country or the state or the region where they came from. If you can't get the specific town, this information can help you narrow that down later when we get to another stage in the research. Now, to that end, you can use any of the previously noted sources. Maybe that 1860 census didn't say where they were from in Germany, but it did say that they came from the German state of Baden. That's an important piece of information to gather. In the course of this process, try to narrow down as much as you can about that immigrant. It's much better to know they came from Hesse than Germany, or Yorkshire than England, or the Piedmont rather than Italy. Anything you can do to narrow that place. This means you may need to go back and review what you've already learned that you may not have paid that much attention to and see what it tells you. Okay? Maybe your ancestor in the census only says Germany, but all of his neighbors mentioned a German state. That might suggest that he came from that same German state. It doesn't prove it, but it might help you. Okay? Once you have this information, then it's much more effective to consider foreign records, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Okay? And then the last tactic, if this hasn't worked for you yet, then start doing some of the very same things for the neighbors and the friends of your immigrant. They did not come here solo. Most of them came because somebody was already here. Of course, somebody had to be the first, but somebody followed. They came because other people from their town came. So use any of the sources we've been talking about to find out about the neighbors and the friends. So you need to carefully track the person's associates. Who did they come with? Are there other people on the passenger list with them? Are there people who are signing the deeds as witnesses and who also were godparents for their children in the church records? Watch out and look for who those people are. Okay? If you haven't had much success on the passenger lists, or you've only found the ancestor, now look for those neighbors and friends on those lists, because sometimes the passenger list will give you more clues for a neighbor or a friend, but not for the ancestor. Take note in the census of any of the neighbors that are there, especially neighbors who may be of the similar age or came from the same country where your ancestor came from. Follow up on the witnesses for the deeds. Who was taking care of that? And particularly consider members of their same church. Take a note at those children's baptismal records. Take a look at the ancestor's marriage record. Who were the witnesses in those records? Now, if you've done all that, you've amassed a lot of great information, and it will really help you. In many cases, you will learn the name of the hometown where the ancestor came from. Then you have a whole other task, and that's identifying the hometown and which one of towns by that name it is. But if for some reason you've gotten that far and you still don't know the name of the hometown, now you can use foreign sources. I call them European sources, but they pertain to wherever the foreign country is they came from. This is the other half of the process. I'm not going to go quite as in-depth because I'm anxious to talk about some of the questions you've got. But here's the key steps when you get to the other half of the process, and that's how to use foreign records, but only once you've used all those records of the new country. When you use those European sources, you first want to make sure that you have no other clue that you haven't already unearthed in the new country. Make sure you've looked at everything. That's the same as this next step. That's why I want to underscore. You make sure you've exhausted the records in the new country. And don't assume that you've done it all until you've checked with somebody else. Have somebody else review this. Ask them, here's what I've learned, here's what I've checked. Is there anything I'm overlooking? You may hire a professional. You may visit somebody at your local family history center, your local genealogical society. Run your research results past some friends and colleagues, okay? So, to reiterate, after you've used all the records in the new country and you have significant clues about their origin, then it's time for you to consider these strategies. Number one, again, as I talked about on the U.S. side, consider the general previous research sources for that country. For instance, the website GeniaNet is a great set of electronic family trees for European trees, particularly French and Germanic trees. It's a source most Americans don't look at. And we're not going to get into that in depth, but it's an example of the fact that genealogy is very, very big and very, very important in many other countries. Australia, England, and the Netherlands are ripe with genealogists, and they have compiled literally millions of trees with millions of people in them. Other countries have done some similar work. France is very excited about genealogy. The Germans are beginning to wake up and doing more about this. Certainly Eastern Europeans are as well. So you will find that people are beginning to publish and post materials in foreign countries about their ancestors. And you might find your immigrant ancestor listed in a book published by their cousin who stayed, or cousin's descendant who stayed behind in the old country, and mentions in his book that Friedrich went to America in the 1850s. And all you need to do is find that link, and then you move forward. Many of these countries, or at least some of them, have some nationwide records. In England, you might be able to look at a census record or civil registration records. So for some nations, they have broad records you can look at to try to find your ancestor. For many of these nations, there are departure records, not just the passengers coming into America, but there are records of people who left Germany, who left England, who left Scandinavia. And you can look for your ancestors there as well. If all those don't work, then depending upon the surname, this isn't great for Jones and Smith, but you can often localize the surname using a variety of tools that we don't have time to go into here, but there are tools out there, including even modern phone books in those foreign countries, where you can look up that surname and begin to find out, wow, there's only 4 or 5 pockets of this surname, and they're all in these counties or these shires in England. So localize where that name is. That may give you some ideas of where that name is most common and where you can start looking more specifically. If you can localize a name, then there are regional records you may be able to look for. Records such as the departure of people from that county or from that town out to another country. Things like that that you can look for. And as you narrow it down, you can eventually get to the local records, such as civil registration, such as church records, where you can now look up the information about an ancestor to see, is that him or her? Because you have enough information from the U.S., you know a birth date or another date, you know a relative in the old country, you know other information about the family. Now you can use that information to help see if he's actually in those local records. So those are the key concepts I wanted to get across. You can read a lot more about it in a couple of books. Ancestry published a couple of these. The Immigration Records chapter, which is chapter 9 in the book The Source, goes into great depth about this very strategy that I've just talked about. Then there's a great book by John Coletta that focuses just on passenger lists, and another book I'll mention as well. They Came in Ships by John Coletta, and American Passenger Arrival Records are great books for you to consider getting a hold of at your local family history center, your local library. I hope you already own a copy of the source. It is the best, most detailed book about this kind of research. And as I indicated, Chapter 9 goes right through these steps, explains them in great depth. There's no secret about it, but it's been tried and true by hundreds of immigrant researchers over the years. Okay? So with that, I want you to be comfortable. You can find an immigrant's origin. It does take work. It does take knowledge. And, as my colleague yesterday would have said, a wee bit of luck, particularly if it's Irish. Now, with that in mind, let's go and start talking about some of the questions that have come in as we prepared for this webinar. We're excited. There's a lot of great questions. We're going to cover as many as we can. Obviously, of the hundreds of questions that came in, we can't talk about all of them, so we've selected some we think are representative of some of the other questions and of the key problems that we've noticed, myself and my colleagues, over the last 30 years of research that seem to crop up time and again in the course of research. So even if a question's specific, I think you'll be able to draw some generalities out of it as well. We had to start off with this one. How can I access the passenger list found on Ancestry? I've never been able to open them, said Terry. Well, this one threw me for a bit of a loop. I thought that shouldn't be much of a problem, but I thought about it a little bit. And on occasion, somebody forgets to get logged in, or maybe doesn't even have their subscription active right now. Or they're using it at a friend's house or something, and they're not quite sure. And so do make sure that you're logged in, make sure that your subscription is current. We're going to come back to that in just a minute, okay? But just to make sure, and we're going to see an example of this, but when you get to the results list for a passenger list search, there's a little icon that says View Image, and we're going to look at that in just a minute. And if all that fails, contact customer service and find out just why you're not getting there. So let's take a look at Ancestry real quickly here, okay? And if you're doing a passenger list, I just zip right to the passenger list here. And just make this really easy. Type in Smith. A couple of Smiths came to America over time. And you're going to get a results list here. There's only about 1.9 million Smiths in the passenger list at Ancestry. But notice when you come through here, you've got an option here. And this one says, okay, since I haven't signed in here, we're going to have to sign in on that and find that. But when you're signed in, you just come over here and click View Image, and it will bring the image up. So make sure you did get signed in, and we'll try that real quickly here. Assuming I can remember my password. And there it is, all right? So now you can see that we're all signed in, and depending upon your website, I've had images, icons come up over here, and I have over here. You can just hit View Image, and it will bring up the actual passenger list. And there is the image of this passenger list. And you have plenty of opportunity here to enlarge it if you want to, or to make it smaller and find it. I hope that answers that question. It's a not an unimportant question. So that's good. Second question. I'd like to learn more about how to find lists, etc., on the card catalog. And I love this question because I love the Ancestry card catalog. Maybe it's the old librarian in me, but it's great to know that the 35,000 databases at Ancestry can be approached on a database by database ability. Okay? And a similar question is, where and how can I find passenger lists for the ships that came into U.S. or Canadian ports other than New York? In other words, Peggy here has been using New York lists and says, well, what about the other lists? They're all at Ancestry. So here's what I want to do. Go to the Search tab at Ancestry and select Card Catalog. So I wanted to make sure we reiterated this concept. The Ancestry Card Catalog is a great tool for your research, and it allows you to find families fairly readily, regardless of find the databases you want. Okay? Come to the Search tab, go to the Card Catalog, and type in a key piece of information, such as the name of a port. We were looking at Baltimore when we lost some connection there. But the fact is that now you have easy access to 35,000 or more databases just by doing a little search of potential titles or keywords. If you want to know, do they have anything about Lithuanians here? You can type in Lithuania or Lithuanian in the title search and see what they might have. So have fun with that one. Okay. Next question. how do I find ancestors of my paternal grandfather, named Andrew Gallagher, born in 1869, who came to the USA in May of 1888? Sally wants to know, he doesn't know her parents' names. First two steps you need to make sure of is that you look for records in the United States that have the parents' names. Look for Andrew Gallagher's death certificate. Look for his obituary. Now, I'm not sure when Andrew Gallagher died, but if he came to the U.S. in 1888, when he was about 19 years old, he probably lived well into the 20th century. If he lived well into the 20th century, there should be a death certificate for him. Most of the last states were keeping death certificates by 1911. So look assiduously for that death certificate, and then, once you know the date of death, look for the obituary. But the death certificate often has the parents' names. Now, Sally may be out there saying, but Kory, I tried that already. It doesn't have his name. That may be true. That doesn't mean that there's no records in America without his name. Depending upon when he naturalized, his naturalization record may name his parents. So continue to look in U.S. records for other records he had. And while you're at that, learn his exact birth date and exact birthplace. Remember we talked about 4 key elements of identification? If you don't know the name of a close relative, such as a father or a mother, that doesn't mean you're out of luck in finding the immigrant. If you can find their exact date and place of birth, and you've got the town name, you've got a birth date, and of course you know his name, Andrew Gallagher, then you can go into that specific town and look for an Andrew Gallagher. Now what happens if you find 2 or 3 Andrew Gallaghers, all born in 1869, but they don't have exactly his right birth date, but you know it's the right town? Then you need to check them out. Find out, did one of those Andrew Gallaghers die as a child in that parish? Did one of them get married and stay over there and didn't come to America? But the more information you can learn from American sources, the safer you'll be in trying to find these answers. Okay? Here's another question from Mr. Schnagel. My ancestors immigrated from Bohemia or Austria, Bohemia being a part of Austria, around 1855. Do you have records from Europe, such as Bremen or other German ports of emigres? This is a wonderful question. Ancestry's collection of continental European records is still growing. Of course, their collection for everything is growing, but their continental European collection is not as grown as much. And it is growing, but it's important to understand that there are good records. Ancestry continues to get more. Ancestry is not the only place to get these records, but some records don't exist. Some records exist, but Bremen passenger lists, for instance, were destroyed. The Bremen officers just didn't see a need to keep the lists after a couple of years. They got their stats for the government, and they didn't keep the lists. We can't restore those. But there are other records available. The Hamburg lists, for instance, are available and are at Ancestry, where you can look for departures out of the port of Hamburg. Okay? There are other lists at Ancestry, okay, under passenger lists, and we can go and look at them real quickly. I'm going to go back to Ancestry real quick and back to the passenger list listing here. And over here they have some featured collections. Okay, there's the Hamburg list. I'm going to hit this little clue, view all in card catalog, and this will give me a subset, all the things listed as passenger lists in the card catalog, and and then it gives you some down here. And notice that they have some filtered by location. So there are some Australian lists. There are some Canadian lists, okay, in this, okay. Filtered by language, there's 2 Swedish lists here. If I click on Sweden right there, come back up here, I'll see they have Swedish emigration records from 1783 to 1951, 1.8 million people. That's a great list, okay? They also have 1 million records of people who left, passenger lists specifically, who left through Gothenburg. So there's lots of good records at Ancestry. Is it everything? No, but it's still some important ones, okay? Next, and this is a tough question. How does one go about finding ancestors when I know they changed their surname, but I don't know what the name was? And there was another question I got from Celeste. What's the best way to go about getting information if you have different spellings of the first and last names and you don't have a birth certificate or a death certificate to go on, but you know the approximate dates? That's a great question. They're related questions. And they go back to the key point I made at the beginning, and that is you still need to do more research in the new country. You can't jump back to the old country without their name as it appeared in the old country. That's just not going to happen. Now, is it easy to do this? No, it's not. That's why you wrote the questions, right? So make sure you're looking at every record under those versions of the name in this country. Then take time, analyze the ancestor's ethnicity and the ancestor's native language. If this is an Italian or a Jewish person or a Scandinavian, it doesn't really matter. Learn what names are common among those. For many non-English speaking countries, those immigrants not only changed their name, they translated them. Therefore, Mr. Carpenter was known as Herr Zimmermann when he was living in Germany. Jacob de Boer, the Dutchman, may have become just plain Boer over here. He may have become the farmer, for that matter. He could have translated his name. Okay, the surname Farmer is obviously a common American name, and it may have been a Dutchman who changed his name from de Boer to Farmer. So keep in mind that sometimes a name was simply translated from the old language. Now, you need to dig into the family tradition just a bit more, learn more about this. My wife's family was convinced that their immigrant ancestor, a German, shortened his name somehow. Well, we've been fortunate, managed to get him back to New York, eventually in a Civil War pension, found a town in Bavaria where they were from, trace a line back to 1648. The name is spelled the same way in 1648 as when my wife was born more than 300 years later. Sometimes the name hasn't changed, even though you think it has. And if it has changed, begin to explore more family records and more American or records in the new country to find that out. Particularly check the church records. The church records, especially when they came to America, may have recorded them in the original record. And so maybe you know the name of their first child. Find the baptism of that first child, and their names in the old country style might still be there. Okay. A couple others I wanted to look at for just a minute. Okay, these are related questions, and wanted to explore these a little while. Ed writes, I have been searching for my ancestors in Italy and what is now in the Czech Republic with no success. I know that Europe's many wars have led to the loss of important materials, but I'd like to know your thoughts concerning how to conduct a thorough search from this side of the ocean. And this is related to Lisa's question. I have found the ship's log record for several ancestors, but I'm unable to find any local European records for them. Their region of Austria, i.e. Galicia, was at times Poland and Ukraine. Wars, time, governments, natural disasters to original records have created many walls for me. In short, I can't trace them beyond the boat. Any suggestions? Well, there's a couple of key concepts to both of these questions, and I wanted to elaborate on that for just a few minutes. First, it's very heartening to know that there's actually been very little record loss, all things considered. I appreciate the wars that have gone forth. Germany was decimated, and yet I've hardly ever run into missing church records that can be tracked back to wars. In fact, sometimes the French incursion into parts of Bavaria in the 1600s created more record loss in the early 1700s than World War II did. And besides that, the French incursion, there were a lot of records created after that date, so that's not as bad when the record loss is earlier on. So first of all, keep in mind that record losses have happened, but not as bad as we think, number one. Number two, records do exist in those old countries. Typically they're in archives. They're typically going to be church records. Most civil authorities, particularly in the Austrian areas, didn't keep many records until the late 19th and early 20th century. The same is true, of course, in the Czech Republic, parts of Italy. Those records do exist. They're generally not online, most of them. Family Search has a growing collection of them. Ancestry is starting to try to grow their collection as well. But you will have to do some record accessing in the old country. That doesn't mean you have to go there. There are many professional researchers who can help you over there, and you can use the internet to find a number of sources to get there, to learn what is where. Most archives have a website that has some inventory about their collections. So I can oftentimes find out records of German congregations that are now in Poland, but were in Germany before. Many of those are housed in an archive in northern Germany. Their archive website tells me exactly what parishes for what years are available in their collection. So use the internet to find what records exist. And again, contact a professional and get some more help if you need to. Okay? Here's another one. What is the best way to get started with great-grandparents such as Bezeski and Groya that left the Posen, Germany area between 1870 and 1885? For those who aren't aware of where Posen, Germany was, it's now in Poland. It's almost due east of Berlin. It's a large region that's now in western Poland, and it's known as the province of Poznan, P-O-Z-N-A-N in Polish. But the best way is always to begin to do more U.S. research. If they left the Posen area between 1870 and 85, I'm presuming they came to North America or some other place where they became immigrants into a new country. So they're not in the U.S. wherever. But for instance, they probably lived to the 1900 census and later. So make sure to look at all those census records. Make sure you know all about them like we talked about at the beginning of the webinar. Find those persons' death certificates. That's really important. But I picked this question in part because there's a lot of sources out there that are beneficial. One I wanted to just alert you to, just to prove Ancestry doesn't have everything yet. We're happy to point to places where the records may be that we don't have yet. There's a website called the Poznan Marriage Project. And it's in English and Polish, so you can really get by with it. And there's the URL. We'll come back to that in a minute. But you can also Google Poznan Marriage Project, and that will bring it up. Hopefully this will as well. And there are some instructions if you can find the English language. But the nice thing here is, you can play with it a little bit, but you can put in the person's name. And the object here is, here we go. If you prefer an English, German, French, Portuguese place, click here for more details. And then you tell it where your computer is. I won't worry about that right now. What they've been doing is they've been taking the microfilms of church records from Posen, and volunteers have been indexing the marriages that are on microfilm. That way, if you know a husband and a wife's name, you can now find out where they got married. Once you find out where they got married, they probably had their children and were born in that same area. So if you only know a surname of the husband and not the wife, you can put that in. But if you know both surnames, you might be able to find that marriage or both names. It's a wonderful tool, and it's just an example of the many things that are out there that so many of us don't know about, and that by contacting other friends in genealogy, visiting your local family history centers, posting questions and things like that, you'll find that kind of information very beneficial for you. So, next question comes from Albert Pfeiffer. My grandparents were born in Krakow, Poland in 1893 and 1901. I do have the names of some of their siblings and my great-grandmother's name. Any tips? That's a great question. There's lots of tips, but let me just share a couple that are pertinent to the immigration issues we're talking about today. First of all, you probably need to do, Albert, a little more U.S. research first. Again, it's a case of maybe wanting to jump in the ocean a little too quick. Okay? I'm not quite sure what your objective is and what tips you want, but make sure you've nailed down everything about them. Make sure you have specific names. That's because they may not have been actually born in the city of Krakow. Krakow was one of the major cities in Poland, and most immigrants who came to North America or went to other countries did not come from major cities. They came from the rural areas. They would often identify themselves as from a major city. Just as I often tell people I live in Salt Lake City, when in reality I live in Salt Lake County outside the city boundaries. Anybody who lives in the LA area knows this concept. They tell you what part of the community they live in, not the major city sometimes. Well, if these were Poles, they may have lived in the city of Krakow. They may have lived in a ghetto outside of Krakow. If they were not Poles, Polish Catholics or German Protestants, they may have lived near but not in the city. So more research is going to help you figure that much out as well. Make sure, therefore, that you know their religion and their ethnicity. I just rattled off 3 different religions and 3 different ethnicities that can be found in and around the environs of Krakow. There are others as well around that city. So make sure you know exactly who you're looking for, because that's going to depend on where you find them. Okay? And I'm happy to let you know that over at Family Search, there are many Polish records on microfilm. I don't know if they have a lot of records around Krakow, but it's a start. And the Polish archives are reasonably helpful, and I know some professional researchers in Poland have done wonders for me in being able to find records. So there is great hope. Another question came in. How do you find your ancestor's nationality? If the records only say a person is black or colored or white, do I really have to go to the country of origin to get information on my ancestor, or can I find that information online? Well, I've got great news. Some of that information is online. You don't have to go there. But I was intrigued by this question because there's not a lot of records that mention the race or color of an ancestor. You don't find a lot of records that say this ancestor is black or colored. The U.S. Census records do. They're probably the most preeminent ones that do. But that just means you need to find more records. If that's a repetitive stream, if that's a broken record, then I'm glad. Because most of the time, as we talk to our clients and ProGenealogists, as we talk to new people, they haven't usually done enough record searching and finding enough records to know about their immigrant. So look for more census records about the person, and you'll learn the country they were born in. Find the person's naturalization record, and that will tell you the country they were born in. Again, go back and analyze their ethnicity, analyze their religion, and that can tell you things as well. Online information is growing, but it's not comprehensive. You will have to access records in the old country, but you may not have to go there to do that. There are ways to do that. So sometimes they're on microfilm, sometimes they're in archives, but you can go ahead and do that kind of research. I love Sally's question. I see it frequently. My grandfather supposedly came to America as a stowaway. In addition, he changed his name from Rotz to Ross. I can find him in some basic census records under his changed name, but nothing else. What else can I do to trace him? Well, we talked about name changes a few questions ago, but let's just add a couple more. First of all, family traditions are not always valid, so make sure you're sure of that. Now, Rats to Ross certainly looks like an Anglicization of a name, a Germanic name of some sort, perhaps, to a more English-sounding name. And that's not bad. It sounds like she's already got a potential version, okay? But look for his naturalization record. Now, there was very few official ways in which somebody changed their name. Families often say, well, my ancestor changed his name at Ellis Island, or they changed his name for him at Ellis Island. That's a family tradition that is probably not totally accurate. Name changes, including my own surname, was modified, but not at Ellis Island. It was modified to become a little more English-oriented instead of the Dutch spelling of Meyerink. So watch for those issues. Sometimes a change isn't significant, isn't major, and a person familiar with the language of your ancestor may be able to suggest to you versions of that name. Many foreign countries have their telephone book online. You can go poking around on a German or a Dutch or a Swedish telephone book online and find out what versions of your name are more common in that foreign country to get that. So as you seek more records, look for records as close as possible to when the immigrant came into the new country. If they had a marriage shortly thereafter in New York City, or a child was born within a year of coming to America, look for those records and see if you can find them. Now, you're saying, but I don't know what the old name was. If you know the child's name, yes, you might. Okay? Look in city directories. Look for military enlistments, other things like that that can help you pinpoint more about that ancestor. Eventually, you'll begin to settle on what the name most likely was as you begin to see it show up in more and more records. So the solution, again, becomes continued research. Here, from Kathy. I'm searching for my third great-grandfather, Joseph Schweitzer. Born in Württemberg, Germany about 1792. Died 1868, lived in Baltimore. Can you tell me the port he came through and if he came with other family and his nationality? Well, Kathy, I can't, but you can. You can do some research, okay? Since he's living in Baltimore, you begin by thinking about Baltimore arrival records. They're available at Ancestry.com, a place you can go look. Württemberg has an emigration index on Ancestry, and the name Joseph Schweitzer is in that index. Is he yours? I don't know. That's up to you to do research. We're going to look at that in just a minute. You do need more information about him, such as his age. If he died in 1868, then he's going to be in the 1860 census, hopefully, maybe the 1850, depending upon when he came. As to his nationality, he was neither German nor Swiss. If he was born in Württemberg, as you say, he was a Württemberger. Württemberg was a kingdom of its own right in up to the time of his death in 1868. He was of a German ethnicity, and when Württemberg joined the Prussian kingdom to create the Empire of Germany, then Germany began. That's not till 1871. So he was probably not Swiss. He was probably just a Württemberger, and we would think of him today as a German. Okay? But in the meantime, let's take a look at that Württemberg emigration index. Okay? I'm going to real quickly go back here and remind myself his name was Joseph Schweitzer. I thought so. And I'll go up here and type in Joseph. And hit enter. And there's only 2 Schweitzers with that spelling in the Württemberg Emigration Index. I need to underscore, this Emigration Index does not include everybody who left Württemberg. It's been estimated that it includes about half of them, but that's just an estimate by researchers. But here is a Joseph Schweitzer who left Germany in May of 1851. Certainly that's an appropriate age, appropriate time for a man who's born in 1792. Here's one who was actually born in 1831, so that's not your man. But more research into this man, you can view his record of, on microfilm as to where he came from in the town of, in and around Dietzingen in Württemberg. And that might be yours. I can't guarantee that, but one way to start is learn more about your Joseph Schweitzer and find out where else are the Schweitzers in Württemberg and what else can you learn about him in Baden, so in Baltimore rather. So essentially back to more research there in Baltimore. Have you looked for his death record in a German church in Baltimore? That might be a place to learn more about him. How about this question from John Barthel? My ancestors arrived in August 1851. Ellis Island was not named yet. Was Castle Garden open in that year, or was there simply a few docks called the Port of New York? I thought this was a great general interest question. It's important for us to understand. One of the questions we won't have time to go into was about somebody who allegedly came into Ellis Island in 1888 and they couldn't find him. Well, it's because Ellis Island records don't start that early. That's part of the problem. So, passenger lists for immigrants coming into America, into the United States, begin in 1820. I want to underscore something here. That's 200 years after the Mayflower. So we're missing 200 years. That's over half of the history of the country where we don't have arrival lists. We'll talk about that a bit in the future. But New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia, all of them start in 1820. Castle Garden, the port in New York, officially began in 1855. So prior to that date, ships just pulled up at the docks in New York, discharged their passengers onto the streets of New York, ready for shysters, flim-flam men, and others to take advantage of them, which is why they started Castle Garden. Too many people were taking advantage of those poor immigrants. Castle Garden did yeoman work up to 1892, at which point Ellis Island was ready to begin as a receiving station. And they closed down in 1954. Ancestry has lists of arrivals into the city of New York covering 1820 through 1957. So even after Ellis Island was closed, there were still people arriving in New York in various ways. So that's a great tool. No place else has that huge collection of records. I love the Family Search people, and they have great collections, but their records don't go as far in time forward, for instance, as Ancestry does here. Okay. When and where did John Hawkins come to the U.S.? Who came with him? Where did he arrive? I'm trying to get information for membership into the CDVII. I'll talk about that in a minute. I've seen dates and places for John Hawkins, but have not seen whether they got any documentation. He was born about 1680. This person wants to join a lineage society. CDVII means Colonial Dames of the 18th Century. Okay? It should have an X in there to make it 18th, but that's why I'm reading CDVII. Colonial Dames of the 18th Century means that you have to descend from an immigrant who came to America in the 1700s or earlier. So, John Hawkins, born about 1680. Well, you know what? Ancestry has some things to help you with that. Well, the point is colonial immigrants have been very well researched, and it's likely that you've got to go back to some of the things we talked about first, about basically what's been researched, okay? I always start these questions with the Passenger Immigration List Index over at Ancestry, okay? And so, and I went for it again, and I went and forgot the name we're working for John Hawkins. And we'll go to John Hawkins in the Passenger Immigration List Index. This is a great index to almost anybody who shows up in the published literature of immigration. And it's particularly useful for the pre-1820 era. As you can see, it goes up to the 1900s. But before 1820, most lists that did survive about immigrants, or many records about them, have been published. And this is an index to published sources. Well, there's a lot of John Hawkins in here. And so we don't know which one. There's like 300 entries for him. Some of them the same person. But notice there's a John Hawkins who settled in Massachusetts in the 1630s. He's in there several times. Here's one who's in Barbados. But how about this John Hawkins? It says that he arrived in about 1653 into Virginia. We can come forward a little bit. We might find other people. Here's one coming in sometime in the 1660s to 1790s in Virginia. If you find a person of interest here, then we click on View Record. And this tells you this person was mentioned in a book called Bristol in America, a record of the first settlers in the colonies of North America. Now, with this book, you can find out, does this book happen to be at Ancestry, or well, else is it online? This one is copyrighted, so Ancestry probably does not have the rights to publish it, but you can still find this book through a variety of other means. So using a tool like the Passenger Immigration List Index can help you with colonial immigrants real well. Here's a note. Some immigrants return to their homeland, in my case Prussia, to visit family, accompany a relative who came to the U.S. Are there any passenger lists available for departures from the U.S. in the mid to 1800s? I love this question, Charles, because number one, it's got an easy and a tough answer. And I love those kind. The easy answer is no. We have no departure list from the U.S. But keep this in mind. When they came back to the country, they should be on the incoming lists, because these lists of arrivals aren't just for immigrants coming for settling down. They're anybody who came into the port, including people visiting, coming back from a visit. So do that, okay? And Ancestry has U.S. passport applications up to 1925 online. This is a great collection, and oftentimes immigrants got a passport to protect them when they went back to their old country. Now, most immigrants never went back, and a lot of people who went back, particularly in the mid to late 1800s, didn't get a passport. But at least it's a database you should be considering and thinking about. Okay? A couple more I want to have real quickly. Diane says, I've been looking for years for immigration data on my grandparents. Came through Ellis Island. Tried every variation of their first and last names, nothing. I know what years they arrived, but there seems to be nothing. What do I do now? How many of you have had that problem? Raise your hands. Great. I can almost see those hands being raised right now. Okay. First, you have to question everything you think you know. Your family tradition is not always correct, so keep that up, okay? Find more documents about them, okay? Keep that in mind as well. Learn Ancestry's powerful search abilities. I want to take just a quick minute and walk you through this issue. And we're going to use it with, believe it or not, my dad, okay? My dad's an Ellis Island immigrant. I know, of course, when he came, but you know, when I get started, you don't. And so I type in George and type in Meyerink and tell it, hey, I'm comfortable enough about that. I want you to match all terms exactly and tell me that. And it finds one person born in 1873 and came in 1882. That's not my dad, please. Okay, he was a little bit younger than that. So I go back and edit the search. And I say, well, let's do this. I actually do know he came when he was about a year old, so that would be 1909. And I can say plus or minus a couple of years if I want to be sure about that. And let's not match them all exactly, but let's make sure I match that date exactly. See how I can vary a lot of ways I search? Okay. Now I came up with George Marinko. Still didn't find my dad. So what's happening? Well, you know, he was a Dutch boy. It could be Shord, his Dutch name. There's not that many Meyerink. Let's take off the name altogether, okay, and just search for Meyerink, okay. Now I've got 50 of them. Can I narrow that all down? Well, I can, but wait a minute. I don't have to. Right there is his father, his mother, and right here, Cornelius is my dad. Cornelius, yes, his name was George. His name was Kors George, K-O-R-S. That's where my name K-O-R-Y comes from. And Kors is a Dutch version of Cornelius. We all know that, right? No, we don't. Sometimes we don't know the information we need to have to be more successful in the work. Ancestry's got some powerful search capabilities to research this. Let's move on fairly quickly before we lose everyone's interest here and go too long. I hear of immigrants coming from Canada before they came to the U.S. Are there records available? Yes. Ancestry has 7.5 million names on the Canadian passenger lists and another 5 million names on border crossings of people who came from Canada into the U.S. That's a great start. In addition, there's another 1 million names on Detroit border crossings. And just to be fair, they have border crossings of people who went from the U.S. into Canada. So there's some great records out there for Canadian immigrants coming as well. Okay. This question's a quick and important one, though. From 1880 to 1902, where were the most common departure points coming to America through Ellis Island, leaving from Sweden and Norway and Germany? Well, in rough order, they would be Bremen, whose records don't exist, Hamburg, whose records are at Ancestry, Göteborg, whose records are at Ancestry, the port of Malmo, and Oslo, Norway. All of these have places where people left from to come to America. Briefly, Frederick Steinke was born in 1834 in Germany, came to the United States in 1860, settled in Wisconsin. That's all he has. Can't find brothers, can't find sisters, or any immigration information. Where can I turn? Well, I took a challenge here, Sandra, and I looked at your family tree at Ancestry, and you've got the 1900 census on your family tree, and I can't get there from here. Okay? Not sure why. We'll worry about that. But let me point out, on that census, Sandra, the 1900 census, it tells you not only that he came in 1860, which is important, but his name is pronounced a little different. It's Steinke. There's an extra I in front of the K. That might have made a difference. But that 1860 census, 1900 census, also says that he was naturalized. So you want to go out there and get his naturalization record. Now, he also died, and your family tree doesn't indicate that. But when I look at the 1900 census at Ancestry, it shows me that he's been found in Find a Grave. Ancestry has been partnering with Find a Grave to put some of those records, or to link to their records over at Find a Grave, and he died in 1924. He will have a death certificate in Wisconsin. Get his death certificate and learn more about him from there, and that might help you with your research. Okay. Lastly, Anthony Brackett and Richard Brackett. Early 1600s, came from New England. We had to talk about colonial immigration real quickly. She can't find Anthony and Richard if they're related or trace their ancestors. I can't believe that's as far back as I can go. Well, first of all, keep in mind, colonial lines may not go any further back than the early 1600s, but there have been research by others. So we mentioned the Passenger Immigration List Index. Check it out. You'll find both Anthony and Richard there as well. You'll also find at a site called Genealogy Book Links a book about them, because Brackett is a New England name. It's an uncommon name, and I thought, you know, is there a book about Bracketts in New England? And so I went over to Genealogy Book Links. I found this book at Ancestry as well. But right here, under Brackett, it says, Brackett Genealogy, descendants of Anthony and Richard Brackett of Braintree. With that information, then you can click on this link, and this website will take you to a public domain, full-text version of that one. Okay? And of course, don't forget to look at the periodical source index also at Ancestry. There are articles there as well. Okay? I'll just leave you with this screen as we close, because our ancestors are from Mexico. We don't want to ignore those as well. Ancestry has a growing collection. They have 13 million names from the 1930 census. They have border crossing records of 5.5 million people who came from Mexico into the U.S. And they even have some records of Mexican immigrants to the U.S. who came into Veracruz, Mexico. So Ancestry is excited to share records from every country they can get them. The fact is, your immigrants want to be found, and hopefully we've given you some tools to find them. So I appreciate the chance to share some time with you, and hope this has been helpful for you. Join us tomorrow night at 8 o'clock p.m. in Eastern Time for Following British Roots from the UK to America. My colleague Kathy will be here to share some great information. If you missed last night's webcast, Tracing Your Irish Ancestors Back to the Homeland with Kyle, there'll be an encore broadcast tomorrow at 6:30 here at www.livestream.com/ancestry. That'll be exciting to have an encore presentation. Remember, you'll be able to view any of these 3 webcasts on this immigration series beginning on March 14th on our YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/ancestry.com. Ancestry.com, excuse me. Thanks again. Enjoy yourself and have success.